the idea was very much to come back to the very basic of the Russian thinking. And I made several charts that show how the architecture of Soviet or Russian, I said Soviet or Russian because in that case, very similar. There are not many changes in the way of thinking war. As I said, the political orientation is totally different, but the way of thinking is the same. And then from the strategic level down to the tactical level, trying to understand how this thinking develops into action, basically. And that's exactly what we are seeing today. That means what we see in the field is basically a tactical translation of what happens at higher level. And that's very uncommon for Western mind, because we used to have a strategic thinking, probably in the 50s, as we started to consider a nuclear war and big war in Europe and things like that. But especially in the last 30 years, when Western armies tried to confront other type of armies, or even rebels in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, we tend to forget the strategic and the operational level to concentrate on the tactical level. And as a matter of fact, I have been several times in North Africa. I worked a little bit in Mali. And I was surprised to see that the French operating in the Sahel region had no real strategy to fight the so-called terrorism or ISIS or whoever you can call it. They had only tactical approach. So you just kill people, that's it. And it's an aim in itself. And that's for that precise reason that at the end, the authorities in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, they decided the French were actually part of the problem. They were not solving the problem. They were part of the problem because there was no strategy, no aim. You shoot at people, but you don't know where to. Where are we going to? Nobody knew that. So, and even the French military, that's very surprising. But that's a symptom of what happened also in Afghanistan. I've been shortly in Afghanistan for my country, and I noticed that there was absolute no understanding of what do we want to achieve there. And in fact, we achieved nothing. And I remember my driver in Kabul, he was a Pashtun, and I asked him, because Pashtun is the same origin basically as the Taliban. I asked him, what do you feel about the Taliban? I said, well, we don't like the Taliban, but if we have to choose between the Taliban and the Westerners, we will choose the Taliban. That shows exactly that we were fighting a war without understanding even how people think. We were just firing at people, period. And that's, in fact, when the West engaged the war in Ukraine, it came in Ukraine with exactly the same approach. So it's a tactical approach. You just fire at people. You just try to have a better weapon, better weaponry, but that's it. There is no real strategy. And we see that, I noticed that when I studied, as I said, I was in NATO at the time, but when I followed the combat operations in the Donbas in 2014, those combat that led eventually to the Minsk agreements, but I was studying the battles that were, we noticed that Ukraine had actually, Ukraine was advised by Western officers, by the way, but there was no really operational thinking behind those. They were just firing at the rebels, whereas the rebels in Donbas, many of them had a Russian military background, and they were fighting even with very little resources, because at the very beginning they had almost nothing. And with the time you had Ukrainian units defecting to the rebels. because the Ukrainian army was basically a territorial army, so you had both Russian and Ukrainian speaking people in the army, and those Russian speaking, they defected to the Russian speaking population, including with weapon, artillery, ammunition, and all that. That's why the rebels could develop quite rapidly a kind of an armored force, and then developed also some kind of operational art based on their education, the military education that some of those guys had from the former Soviet Union. And I noticed here a total difference in the approach of war. And this was confirmed after the beginning of the special military operation, that you had a Ukrainian army that, by the way, was in between two different, I would say, thinking systems. A lot of people were used to, I mean, probably they were very young, but they started their military career being trained in the Soviet system. But then came the end of the Cold War, and these guys tried to enter into a new thinking system or new concepts, mostly NATO oriented. And that's exactly what you see today in the Ukrainian army. They are between two systems. And that's deadly, because you don't have let's say a doctrinal reference point. You don't have a doctrinal baseline to make your operation, and that's a fundamental weakness that the Ukrainians have. While on the Russian side, as I said, there's a total continuity in the military thinking between the Soviet time and today. They adjust a few things because obviously technology developed and evolved, and you had to adjust some for instance, command and control assets and command and control systems and all that. But basically, we are on the same doctrinal baseline as before. As a result, you don't have any discrepancy between generals and junior officers. And that's something you don't find in